Boker Tov and Happy New Year to you, Talmudim. It is time once again for Soulful Psalms. And this week we're going to be talking about Psalm 33. It's an odd psalm. It has a number of different odd features to it that we need to deal with, and especially in its transmission history. That is how it has come down to us. So, uh, first of all, reminder that there are several different versions of the Bible that come down to us from antiquity. We have the Masoretic text, which is the text in Hebrew, which all Jews use as authoritative. On the other hand, in much of the Christian world, the Septuagint, or the 70, is the Greek version of the Bible that was incredibly influential for many Jewish communities that spoke Greek. And in fact, it is the Septuagint that is the basis for much of what goes on in the gospel. The time of this translation, we don't know. We can't say for certain that it was derived directly from the Masoretic text because we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls that there are several slightly variant families of scriptural manuscripts. So one can make the argument that the Masoretic text comes from one of those traditions or families of text, and the Septuagint comes from another. And some of the complexities of that meet here in Psalm 33. So, for example, if you're talking about the Septuagint, it has a superscription. It tells us that it is a Psalm of David. On the other hand, the Masoretic text has no superscription whatsoever. It begins at a very logical place, which is it sounds like the opening of a psalm. Sing forth, you righteous, to the Lord. It is fit that the upright acclaim him. That's a great opening line. So it makes sense that that is the beginning, even if there's no record of who or how it was composed. Yet we also have a few Hebrew manuscripts that actually attach 33 to the bottom of 32. So for a while, Psalm 32 and Psalm 33 were perceived as a single psalm. Maybe that's what happens when you don't have a superscription to distinguish them. But in any case, so there's, in terms of transmission history, how this has come down to us, it's a little wonky. What I do want to say is it's a nice psalm. In traditional Jewish practice, it is recited at Tashlich, and it is also recited in some forms of Pasukei de Zimra. But as much as it is recited in whole, more often we see bits and pieces of it plucked out and used in different liturgical contexts. I've used this term for you before. It's the source of lectionaries, that is, stringing verses from different sources together to create a new coherent whole. Very common in liturgy in general, very common in Jewish liturgy. And I'm just going to draw attention to two individual sections of this particular psalm. So I'm going to go with the later will be former. I'm going to go a little further into it, then I'm going to go back later. So a famous passage in here, which I think is a very important one, is 16, 17, and 18, which reads as follows: Kings are not delivered by great force. Warriors are not saved by their great strength. Horses are a false hope for deliverance. For all their great power, they cannot save. Truly, the eyes of the Lord are on those who fear him. All right. So that is a common biblical motif, which is to say that the person who is a pure materialist, who simply looks to the obvious, the manifest, and says, I am weak, I am strong, I am protected, I am not protected, based on any number of criteria. How big is your army? How big is your bank account? How big is your family? These things have important factors in our success in the world, but not alone. And this is an idea that is repeated again and again in the Hebrew Bible. Man does not live by bread alone. And elsewhere, we are reminded again and again that a purely material existence is inadequate. Most of us aren't satisfied with that. Most of us feel like we need to be in touch with things beyond the things we can touch. And this psalm is reminding us of that. So, as much as we fantasize about having 20 firearms or 60 firearms, and somehow the more we have, the more safe we are, that isn't always the case. So just keep that in mind. But what I really want to talk to you about ever so briefly is verse 6. I love verse 6 because I think it's a lot of fun, and it's had a disproportionate role in Jewish mysticism. And I will read it. It's very simple and it fits right into biblical tradition about God's creative power, but mystics take it a step further. And the verse simply says, Bidvar Adonai Shemaim Na'asu. By the word of God, the heavens were created. All right, and that fits right into what we've read in Genesis. God commands, let there be light, and there will be light. Speech acts is what is known in biblical tradition. God makes reality through speech acts. And that actually has some truth in the human world, right? I'm reading a biography of J.L. Austin, whom you've never heard of, I'm sure. But J.L. Austin was a post-World War II British philosopher who was very interested in the role of words in creating philosophy, and beyond that, creating reality. And in fact, his most famous book is How to Do Things with Words. And what Austin argues, and I think is true, it's a very important book for ritual studies and for understanding the potency and efficacy of rituals, is that Austin argues that if a certain phrase is said in the right context, under the right conditions, that has the power to change reality. Now, that's a grand claim, but think of it in these terms, because this is the example Austin uses to start off. He says, imagine you're in a room, there's a man and there's a woman, they exchange rings, and the officiant says, I now pronounce you man and wife. Now, if that were said outside of that context, if the other ritual parts weren't there, it wouldn't mean much of anything, but we consider that to be an act that changes their status from both being single to both being married to each other. Words change reality. And anybody who's worked with contracts knows that after we sign the contract, our reality has changed from before we signed the contract. The words make a difference. And that's Austin's essential insight. And that is the insight that comes with Genesis, that God makes things happen. We can make things happen. Now, I alluded to Jewish mysticism. So let me just tell you this little bit, which I just think is charming and delightful because it's just an extension of this idea of the power of words. So in the Hebrew, when it says Bidvar Adonai, it literally says in the word Adonai or Lord. But in biblical Hebrew, there is an implied construct. Yeah, I think that's the right term, construct. So there's an of there. Now, there is no written particle for of in biblical Hebrew. You just have to insert it there. In modern Hebrew, we have the particle shel. The devar shel Adonai would be by the word of the Lord. But that doesn't exist in biblical Hebrew. And the mystics take advantage of this absence by saying, yes, you could read it that way, prosaically, as if it were talking about the speech acts of God in Genesis. But imagine this. Imagine if that of is not there. And if the of is not there, because it's not there in a particle, then the phrase becomes through the word Adonai. In other words, the word Adonai, the name of God, has its own potency. How potent is it? You can create the heavens from it. And so Jewish word mysticism comes to this conclusion that the names of God are actually things that perform mighty deeds, that if you include the name of God in a certain circumstance, that you can very much change reality, right? So knowing the name of God is very powerful. So to give you an example from the medieval Midrash, it teaches that the first wife of Adam was Lilith, and Lilith and Adam have a fight. We're not going to get into the details right now. And when it becomes clear that God is going to take Adam's side, Lilith, who knows God's sacred name, pronounces it and is able to teleport herself to the far ends of the seas. So it has the power of teleportation. This verse explains that. It says you can actually create heaven. You can create the skies by knowing how to use that word constructively. Now, it's kind of a, I don't know, mystical pin code or password that allows you to access God's power. Of course, we don't really believe that anymore. More's the pity, because I know the name and I can use it if I needed to, but it's probably not going to do what J.L. Austin wants it to do. But in any case, all of this illustrates the idea that in Judaism, we are very conscious of the fact that words have power. Maybe not to make the skies or the heavens, but we can certainly break a person's heart with our words. And I always love a wonderful cartoon that I saw in, I think it was the New Yorker, where these two children are arguing and the mother intervenes and she says, Deborah, don't hit your brother. Use your words. It will hurt for much, much longer. And that's actually true. The funny English phrase that we learned as children, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me, is not really true. And in fact, it seems in itself to be a kind of magical formula to try and fend off the very, very potent power of words to hurt us, not to break our bones, but rather to break our hearts. So this reminds us in Jewish tradition to always weigh your words carefully and to respect them and to extend them to other people with respect. We have a hard time doing that. And it's even gotten worse now that we are semi-anonymous on the internet. So remember that through the word Adonai, the heavens were created. Through the words we utter, we can destroy a relationship or self-esteem forever. So with that, I'm going to stop and I am going to think about, we're probably going to do Psalm 34 next week. And until then, I hope you have a wonderful week.